Hello, everyone. Welcome to this lecture series on women's writings in India, issues and perspectives. This is a series of 10 open to public online lectures sponsored by the South Asian Studies program at Princeton University in collaboration with Indraprastha College for Women of the University of Delhi. My name is Fawzia Farooqi. I'm a faculty member at the program in South Asian Studies at Princeton University, along with Dr. Rekha Sethi from Indraprastha College for Women, University of Delhi. I'm a co-organizer of this lecture series. This lecture series aims to introduce participants to the richness and diversity of women's writings in Indian languages. We invite eminent scholars from India to discuss Indian women's writings emerging from various Indian language traditions. Usually, each lecture focuses on a renowned woman writer from a distinct language tradition, examined through a particular feminist lens. But today's session is special and different in a sense that so far we have been focusing on language-based canons of Indian women's writings in each lecture, and we have been focusing on one particular author. However, in this session, we are focusing on a canon on Indian women's writing that is spread across various Indian languages and is situated at the intersection of caste-based identity and patriarchy. Today's session is on Dalit women's writing from Western India. We are focusing mainly on Marathi and Gujarati. And we have two eminent guest speakers today. I'm honored to introduce Professor Sachin C. Ketkar, who's a bilingual writer, translator, editor, blogger, and researcher based in Baroda, Gujarat. He works as a professor in English Faculty of Arts at the Maharaja Sayaji Rao University of Vadodara. He has extensively translated present-day Marathi and Gujarati poetry into English. He won Indian Literature Poetry Translation Prize for his translations of modern Gujarati poetry in 2000. He has translated fiction from various Indian and Western languages into Marathi. Our second speaker today is Aparna Langevard Bose. She is a trilingual writer, poet, critic, and translator. She is a professor in the School of Literary Studies of English at English and Foreign Languages University in Hyderabad. Her areas of interest and research include comparative literature, African literature, Indian literatures, Dalit literatures, translation, folk literature, post-colonial diaspora, poetry and feminist writings. She has published 2 books of poetry, 1 book of translations, and edited 3 books that include Writing Gender, Writing Self, Memory, Memoir, and Autobiography. So we have 2 speakers who not only translate literary texts from India, but focus on Dalit writing and Dalit feminist writing. And this is, we are focusing on Marathi and Gujarati writings, but this, as I said, that this can and goes beyond Western Indian languages. We have very robust Dalit feminist writing and Dalit writing in Hindi and in other languages. Professor Ketkar is from Gujarat, and I know my language is Urdu. I know that there is a Dalit Urdu writer from Gujarat, Jayant Parmar. So this session, as I said, is very important because it doesn't represent a particular linguistic canon of Indian women's writing. It goes beyond that. And in one session, we cannot do justice to Dalit feminist writing. We can have a full-fledged series on Dalit feminist writing itself. But this is just a way to include and acknowledge this very robust canon that has emerged within the larger canon of Indian women's writing. It's a way to learn and understand about this canon, and also perhaps do some sort of comparative study between this canon and other kinds of writings that we have been focusing on and discussing so far. So the structure of the session is going to be first, Professor Ketkar will speak for around 35-40 minutes, and then Professor Aparna is going to speak, and then we will open up the session for follow-up discussions and Q&A. So Professor Ketkar, welcome to the session, and we are looking forward to your talk.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Professor Fauzia and Professor Rekha Shetty for having me here. I would like to thank the Princeton University and Indraprastha College for giving me a kind of platform to share my views on the topic. And as we are aware, this topic is vast. Means if you look at it, then Dalit movements in Gujarat and Maharashtra have very different historical trajectories and very different dynamics so it's very difficult. It would be very difficult for me to, I think, to pack many things in 35 to 40 minutes, but I will try my best, whatever I can do. I would talk a bit about Dalit writing in Marathi and in Gujarati. And I would also talk a bit about Dalit feminism. Means that's the category that I would like to lay out. And then in the light of all this discussion, I want to look at two major Marathi short story writers. One is Urmila Pawar, and second is Pradnya Daya Pawar. I would have loved to discuss Gujarati Dalit women's writing, but I came across very few texts written by Dalit women writers, and unfortunately, they were not available in translation either. So that is but I can talk about it if time permits, and if there are questions specific about them. So I would like to begin by sharing my screen. So I hope I can share my screen now. Is it possible? I think host has disabled participant screen sharing. So if
I guess we need to make him co-host.
Yeah, I just did. Please check now, sir.
Okay. Yeah, I hope my presentation is visible. Dalit feminism in Western India. First of all, I would like to actually talk a bit about the term Dalit and Dalit literary movement and Dalit activism in the Western region of India. And the term Western India implies that both Maharashtra and Gujarat, along with many other states, had a kind of shared history at the time of Bombay presidency under the colonial rule. And that's why there are a lot of give and takes and interactions that have happened over this period. There is a common institutional legacy, as well as many important figures from Maharashtra and Gujarat have actually been circulating in this time. And so Western India as a category would include both Gujarat and Maharashtra. After 1960, as we are aware, it bifurcated into two. And we have independent Gujarat and independent Maharashtra after 1960. The term Dalit goes back to actually 19th century, mid-19th century, in the great anti-Brahmin or non-Brahmin movement started by Mahatma Jyotiba Rao Phule and Savitribai Phule, his wife and his compatriot. Both of them were writers. Both of them were very, very influential social activists. And the term Dalit became more, actually implies downtrodden and exploited. And as a broad category, it can include anyone who is oppressed, marginalized, deprived, and downtrodden. So this is the broad sense of the term Dalit, while the specific sense in the way we use it in Marathi emerged only with another great leader, Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar, who made it specifically to in the context of the people who were branded as untouchables. And that's where it got a specific meaning of those communities and those castes which were at the bottom of the caste ladder, and those who were stigmatized as untouchables. So, and the, because of this history, the tension between the broad sense of the word Dalit and the specific sense of the word Dalit has been one of very it haunts history of Dalit movement as well as Dalit literature, and there have been wars over what actually constitutes Dalit, and very often leading to kind of bifurcation and splinters in the Dalit movement, per se. So this history is very significant. And after Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar converted to Buddhism with a huge following, mostly from one specific Dalit community called the Mahars. He converted to Buddhism, and there were other untouchable communities as well who converted, but primarily it was the Mahar caste that was who accepted the new religion, and they became neo-Buddhist. And both the writers that I will be talking about come from that section of the society. And the theme also in both of these writers, you can see, touches upon this neo-Buddhist and Buddhist heritage as well. So after demise of Dr. Ambedkar in 1956, the term Dalit became one of the categories for literary and political agitation. And the party that he had started, the Republican Party of India, went into various kind of factions and splinters. So by the time we come to the 60s, we have a new generation of Dalit activists who are educated in places like Milind College and Siddharth College, and these new generation younger people are disillusioned by the conventional faction-ridden politics. And in the beginning of the 70s, they launch an agitation called Dalit Panther Movement, which becomes a kind of flashpoint and one of the most powerful agitations and movements in the history of Western India and also India. And it then splinters later on. Dalit Panthers, many of them were very famous writers like Zavi Pawar, like Namdev Dasar, and so on and so forth. And we know Daya Pawar and among many other writers. So this is a kind of trajectory of Dalit movement. And Dalit literature also, its history goes back to non-Brahmin movement of Jyotiba Phule, where there were things like Satyashodhak Jalsa or the Tamasha troops, performing arts, which used to propagate message of Phule and Satyashodhak Sabha to larger audiences. So there were these performances, and later on in Dr. Ambedkar's movement as well, we have Ambedkari Jalsa or Ambedkari Tamasha, a folk performative genre that is reconfigured for spreading the vision of Dr. Ambedkar. So this is a kind of pre-history of Dalit literature, and modern Dalit literature emerges in the 60s with people like Baburao Bagul, Shankarrao Kharat, and others. Now in Gujarat, as we are aware, one of the leading influences on Gujarati culture is Mahatma Gandhi. And we are aware of the political differences and a kind of critiques that Dr. Ambedkar launched against Mahatma Gandhi and his movement. And Gandhi coined the term Harijan, and that stuck for fairly some time to indicate the Dalits. And then it was later only in the mid-70s that one of the factions of Dalit Panther, especially the Raja Dhale faction. Other faction was Namdev Dasal faction. So Raja Dhale faction comes to Gujarat, and then you have a kind of little magazine movement with magazines like Akrosh and Kalo Suraj coming up in Gujarati, and in the after 75. So, but for Dalit movement to pick up in Gujarat, we have to wait till 80s, where Dalits were targeted as part of uh, pro anti-reservation stir by the upper caste people, and the targeting of Dalit in the 80s was one of the reasons why Dalits took to arms. And after that, we find a great spurt of Dalit literature in Gujarati. And we have people like Joseph McWan, whose Angaliyat is a famous novel, and people like Dalpat Chauhan, Nirav Patel, and many others. Uh, Comparatively speaking, I find that Dalit fiction, especially by women, is not prominent in Gujarati. While because of presence of people like Urmila Pawar and Pradnya Daya Pawar, it's a very prominent genre in Marathi. But even that, in comparison with autobiographies, which Aparna will talk about, and poetry, fiction has been marginal to Dalit literature as compared to autobiography and poetry, and even theater to some extent. So some of the major Dalit women writers have written autobiographies and poetry, but fiction I found prominently by these two people. So I will now continue what I have to share and begin my discussion of this brief overview of both Dalit literature in both the languages. One of the things that we have to keep in mind, that gender as a transformative political category was central to both non-Brahmin or a-Brahmani movement by Jyotirao Phule, as you can see in 1827 to 1890, as well as Dr. Ambedkar, 1891 to 1956. So both these stalwarts, towering leaders, recognize that gender is one of the most important aspects for social transformation, for annihilation of caste, for transforming the society. So that is something that we have to keep in mind. Phule and Savitri Phule pioneered women's education, championed widow remarriage, and ran infanticide prevention center and an orphanage for children of widows. And they also used to support strike by, say, for example, barbers who said that we won't shave widows. So they used to support them, and that's how. One of the leading figures associated with Jyotiba Phule and Savitribai Phule was Tarabai Shinde, who was part of Phule's Satyashodhak Sama, who wrote this Tri Purush Tulna in 1881, which, according to Suzy Tharu and K. Lalita, it is probably first full-fledged argument against fully feminist argument after the poetry of Bhakti period. And I'm not personally very sure whether Bhakti movement can be categorized as a feminist movement, given the fact that it was not primarily about transforming a secular social world, but more as a removal of obstacles in the path towards God, in the Paramarth rather than in Prapanchik domain. So it is, I think, Phule's movement that is the first modern beginning of feminist activism in India. And her books, Tri Purush Tulna, is very strident, aggressive, and it interrogates not just society and patriarchy, but as it is embedded in culture and literary forms. She attacks contemporary literature of times for stereotypical representation of women, which is far ahead of its time. And she attacks the reformers as well, upper caste reformers like Agarkar, and showing that they don't recognize the value of caste, and it's like something that is done from top and it won't really make difference to the large section of society. So Tarabai Shinde's Stree Purush Tulna is probably one of the earliest feminist literary criticism as well. And it comes from non-Brahmin background. A distinction has to be made between non-Brahmin as a category and Dalit as it was used by Ambedkar and his followers. Non-Brahmin even included some of the upper caste people, and that is one of the that became later on one of the shortcomings of the movement as well. Then we are aware how Ambedkar, in his very first essay, one of the earliest statements on mechanism of genesis of caste, points out its endogamy. That is one of the defining mechanisms of caste, and with relation to exogamy or Gotra system, caste emerges as a category. So, and both endogamy and exogamy have to do with women as a unit of exchange. So it is all about controlling, dominating, and the economy of women decided by patriarchy. That is at the basis of caste system. Is something that Ambedkar recognized early on, and right up to his all his movements, there was a lot of women participants. And of course, in Hindu Code Bill, he tried to reform the Hindu law and made provisions for the laws like equal rights to property and maintenance, marriage, and divorce, something that didn't go down well with the Orthodox members of the assembly. So this history is very important when we think of Dalit feminism. However, what happens on Indian, maybe on Indian as a Indian scale, that women's movement in India follows a different historical trajectory. And you find in national movement, there were many women who participated, and it was only during 70s that I'm not going to read the whole slide given the shortage of time that I have. But it's in 70s, especially after this report that on condition of women, that feminist movements becomes a major movement in as a mass movement. There were writers who were influenced by feminism in Marathi. Pandita Ramabai is a very great name, and she was activist and a reformer. And then we have people like Maltibai Bedekar or Vibhavari Shirurkar, as she is called, who work for widows as well as the nomadic tribes who were labeled as thieves. So these were individuals, but only after 75 that it becomes a kind of movement in India. And this is precisely where later on, maybe in the 90s, that Dalit feminism as a category starts emerging. And this is what Sunaina Arya and Akash Singh Rathore have to say about Dalit feminism. They argue in that book, Theorizing Dalit feminism, that Indian feminists have a widespread inclination towards taking the feminist thesis as their premise and abandoning women's relation to caste. The neglect of Dalit in the Indian discourse on gender is deep and problematic because Dalit women occupy subordinate positions in the most organized production of feminist knowledge. Theorizing feminism within Indian context, therefore, entails the need to interrogate and redefine Indian feminism from a Dalit point of view. So this is one very important assumption or principles of Dalit feminist theory. And they also explain that we seek to begin to canonize this discipline in order to not just supplement, but alter Indian feminism, to reorient Indian feminism so that it is able to function adequately for gender justice. Broadly, they point out there are two primary challenges for the development of this sort of Indian feminist thought that we champion. And the first challenge is caste privileged feminists have been at the forefront of the debate and consequently claim to represent all women's issues in India. This is deeply problematic. Second, there have been sophisticated theoretical claims that a contemporary theory of gender seems to be impossible since women cannot be homogenized, especially in the Indian context, that is advanced by Susie Theru and Tejaswini Niranjana and others. So you find that these are two contradictory positions within which Indian feminism seems to be, I think, poised right now. And this contradiction is not something that has been resolved adequately even today. And on one hand, whether you should speak about gender and only upper caste feminists claiming to speak for all women in India, as against that people who believe that you cannot speak for all the women, as a woman is not a homogeneous category. So these opposite positions, I think, are being negotiated in Dalit feminism as well as feminism in India. And one of the most important statements on Dalit feminism comes from Sharmila Rege. She says that the feminism that developed in the 70s differed from the left-oriented feminist thinking before that in three crucial areas: the categories of women, experience, and personal politics. All were central to feminist theorization. Though powerful as political rhetoric, these categories posed theoretical problems. The category woman was conceived as being based on the collective state of women being oppressed by the fact of their womanhood. As the three categories were deployed in combination, it often led to exclusions around race, class, caste, and ethnicity. And she's speaking about feminist movement as an international phenomena. From such an epistemological position, there are either a complete invisibility of experiences of Dalit women, or at the base, only a token representation of their voices. There was thus a masculinization of Dalithood and Savarnization of womanhood, leading to classical exclusion of Dalit womanhood. That is what she is arguing. And she goes on to argue that in times of globalization and Hindutva, Rege says gender issues are being appropriated as cultural issues. This calls for reformulation of our feminist agenda to reclaim our issues and reconceptualize them such that the feminist politics poses a challenge to the caste class conceptualization of Brahminical Hindutva. Such reconceptualization calls for a critique of Brahminical hierarchies from a gender perspective. And I will dwell upon Sharmila Rege's thesis a bit, because that's a very important intervention in, I think, Indian history of Indian feminist thought. And she says, and she talks about what happens in 90s, especially with the formation of National Federation of Dalit Women, All India Dalit Women's Forum, and Maharashtra Dalit Mahila Sangatna is formed in 1995. And as we are also aware that this was also the time after implementation of Mandal Commission, where caste became a very important issue in public discourse, in a popular public domain on a very big scale. In 1996, you have Vichar Vanchit Dalit Mahila Parishad to commemorate 25 December, the day Ambedkar set fire to Manusmriti as Bharatiya Stri Mukti Divas. And there were other organizations for Dalit Christian women as well. All this new institutions and forums coming up led to a very interesting debate between Gopal Guru, as many of you would be aware of. Dalit women talk differently in EPW, which led to a kind of series of responses from various feminist groups. And a 2-day seminar was also organized by Alochana, Center for Research and Documentation on Women, in 1996. And this is, I think, the theoretical formulation or conceptualization of Dalit feminism that Sharmila Rege is advancing here. She says that how Dalit feminist is different from both Dalit women speaking as well as the feminists of upper caste who claim all women, to speak for all women. So you find a new category, Dalit feminist standpoint. She says it's viewed as emancipatory since the subject of its knowledge is embodied and visible. She goes on to say that this position claims a higher emancipatory status than other position and counters pluralism and relativism, which posit all knowledge-based and political claims as valid in their own way, something that probably Gopal Guru is advancing, that if Dalit women speak differently, then there is no common ground to articulate feminism. So that would lead to a kind of relativization and pluralism, which will actually cut off the dialogue probably between the Dalit feminist and the non-Dalit feminist. And she goes on to say that the subject of agent of Dalit woman standpoint is multiple, heterogeneous, and even contradictory. The category Dalit woman is not homogeneous. Such a recognition underlines the fact that subject of Dalit feminists' liberatory knowledge must also be subject of every other liberatory project. And this requires a sharp focus on the processes by which gender, race, class, caste, and sexuality all construct each other. Thus, Dalit feminist standpoint is open to liberatory interrogations and revisions. So she leaves this room open for self-critique, which is extremely important here. And she also posits that the whole category of Dalit women is not a homogeneous category. And I would like to point towards, again, Gujarat, where the category of Dalit would be a kind of different category compared to what we mean by Dalit in Maharashtra, because very often there is openness in Gujarati Dalit literature for non-Dalits to write on Dalit issues from an Ambedkarite reformist position. And one example that comes to my mind is Praveen Gadvi, a very famous Dalit poet. He is not Dalit by birth. So this kind of openness that you find in Gujarati category of Dalit is something that is at the heart of contestations of what you mean by Dalit in Maharashtra. So when we speak of Dalit women, then we have to be very, I think we have to historicize and be specific. What do you mean by Dalit in the first place? And this is an unresolved issue. For example, somebody like Meena Kandasamy would not be accepted as Dalit writer in, say, for example, in Maharashtra, but in Gujarat, she may be accepted as Dalit writer. So all this various, so this, even if you use Dalit as a ground of comparison, we have to be aware of their differences here. So this is heterogeneity and contradictory nature of the category of Dalit, which Sharmila Rege is a very important perspective, I think. And the stories that I've just circulated, I'm sure you must have found some time to go through both of them. Actually, can bring out this heterogeneity in very interesting ways. The Dalit feminist standpoint, which emerges from the practices and struggles of Dalit women, may originate in the work of Dalit feminist intellectuals, but it cannot flourish if it is isolated from experiences and ideas of other groups, and must educate itself about the histories, preferred social relations, the utopias and struggles of the marginalized. For example, Tarabai Shinde, writing from anti-Brahmin perspective, was not Dalit by Ambedkarite notion of somebody who is born in an untouchable caste. So what do you mean by Dalit is always has to be historicized and specified. I think whenever we talk about the term Dalit in India. So transformation from their cause to our cause, she says, uh, is feasible for subjectivities can be transformed. By this, we do not argue that non-Dalits can speak as or for the Dalit women, but they can reinvent themselves as Dalit feminists. Such a position, therefore, avoids narrow alley of direct experience-based authenticity and narrow identity politics. Now, one of the issues in Maharashtra, especially, is the conventional left, right, who does not want to look beyond the identity of labor and working, would accept caste as a significant category, right? So the whole moves made by upper caste feminists to say that we should move beyond identity politics by left feminists is seen with some suspicion, because there are tensions within the Marxist left, largely upper caste, but not always, largely upper caste activists and intellectuals and the Dalit writers. And that conflict goes back to Ambedkar's times, where he wrote on Buddha and Marx, so in 1936. So these are I don't see them as resolved issues, but these are the tensions which are apparent very often in Dalit feminist theoretical writing as well as creative writing. Interestingly, I could find very few women Dalit poets in Gujarati. Compared to, say, in Marathi, you have many important voices, very many, starting with Hirabai Bansod, Jyoti Langevard, and many others. So while looking at women's participation in Dalit movement in Gujarati, I find very few names. So this is also something that struck me while doing a kind of comparative analysis here. So keeping these debates and formulations in mind, it's possible to analyze two short stories by eminent Dalit feminist writers, Urmila Pawar, born in 1945, titled Baichi Zat, Woman as Caste, which I have circulated, and a story Exit by Pradnya Daya Pawar. Both these stories are the very first stories. No, Exit is very first story in Pradnya Daya Pawar's, as articulating a critique of caste, gender, and class hegemonies in very different historical contexts. And not that I have researched both the writers thoroughly, I just read what I could lay my hands on. Along with caste and gender, class is also a very important category, something that we should not lose sight of, and something that sometimes people tend to underplay in Dalit feminists, as well as Dalit literature in general. The idea of class is a very important, and because it's associated with Marxist analysis, people think that it's something that stands in opposition to Ambedkar. But Ambedkar's own position, as some of us may be aware, is not so simplistically anti-Marxist. It's not that way. It's not. So he found ways to collaborate with Marxists as well. Urmila Pawar, and one of the reasons why I bring up Urmila Pawar is she documented the voices of women who participated in Ambedkarite movement on the lines of, we also made history in Telangana movement. We have similar documentation, which is rich, coming up in 1989. I think this is one of the first important Dalit feminist texts to emerge in Maharashtra, in Western region. So it documents stories of those women who participated in Ambedkar's movement. So they were very old, and Urmila Pawar has documented them very well. So that's a very important statement. Apart from that, she is a very important autobiographical writer. Her own autobiography, Aidan, I think Aparna will talk about it. is a very important autobiography in Dalit. So like Baby Kamble, Jeene Amuche, which is another important feminist Dalit autobiography. Her autobiography is very important. Aidan, and it has also been made into play. And while going through it, I found that some of times the dialogues like, for example, men among Dalit community would tell her that it's the upper caste women who are oppressed, right? It's not, our women are not oppressed, they have freedom, to which she opposes and points out how that is not true. That is very interesting. So uh, this story, Baichi Zat, is very interesting. It talks about an educated Dalit woman who discovers that her husband has decided to get married again because she has failed to bear him a child. And this is a kind of history which has repeated, because in her own house, another woman also has undergone the same humiliation. And very interestingly, her brother, the protagonist's brother, who is supposed to be supporting her, actually goes over to her husband's side and and sells her out on that. To which the other older woman comes in, steps in, and provides the evidence that the husband has really got married in the court of law. So that is how she supports her in her legal fight against this. What is important here is that there is a kind of problem of solidarity of women based on shared experience of being oppressed and marginalized by the second marriage of her husband. That is a very important, and she belongs to the earlier generation of Dalit feminist writer. While Pradnya Daya Pawar's story Exit, which has of the same title and comes from her story called Afwa Khari Tharavi Munun. He is a kind of postmodern short story in the sense that it talks about issues of caste, gender, sexuality in a contemporary, globalized and urbanized cultural space. Uh, while a story by Urmila Pawar is written in a realistic manner with a surprising end where the old woman whose husband has remarried and she has silently suffered steps in to help the younger generation educated women. That's the surprise end to the story. While Pradnya Daya Pawar's story employs the postmodern device of metafiction. I'm sure some of you must have taken a look at that story, where the Dalit female protagonist of her fiction enters the author's room and engages in a dialogue regarding representation of her sexual life and author's sworn allegiance as a politically committed author. So there is a fictional character in dialogue with the author. Now this is metafiction, one of very common postmodern device, as Patricia Waugh has pointed out. And this self-reflexivity and depiction of highly urbanized space where caste issues operate very subtly rather than blatantly. So it's not so blatant, but they are still working. You find in Pradnya Daya Pawar's story. And one story is called Pedicure, which is also very interesting. So I will just mention that and stop because I've run out of my time. It talks about a Dalit couple who is very well-to-do, living in urban metropolitan city with an urban metropolitan lifestyle, and the woman who comes to do pedicure at her home is an upper caste Brahmin. And this is not a big deal for the protagonist, but for her husband, he is elated to find that Brahmin is actually touching a Dalit's feet. And to which the protagonist tells him that this is not about caste, but it's about gender. You like it because of your own macho and masculinity, which compels him to transform. And then he, towards the end, decides to do pedicure to this Brahmin women. So that's a very strange kind of the dynamics of caste that operate. So you can see it talks about very contemporary cultural setting and a very different uh, uh, context from Urmila Pawar's more realistic. And Urmila Pawar's writing has a kind of autobiographical touch. And very often the issues that she talks about are found in many, means are cannot be merely limited to Dalit women. For example, the mother-in-law and her father-in-law oppose her going on to a new flat. Because they see it as a kind of betrayal. And so you can see that many of the things would be, and this is where the whole question of class would also come in. So my own position would go along with Sharmila Rege's and see that there are still overlaps and possibilities of dialogues between, even between non-Dalit feminists and Dalit feminists. There is a possibility of dialogue. And I personally feel that gender is far older, entrenched category and has a kind of almost global sweep, given this very strong embedded entrenchedness of this hierarchy, right? And historically, caste seems to have come later. So given these facts, there are possibilities of dialogue wherever a critique of patriarchy is involved. So that's my take on this. So I think I have kept to the time. If there are questions regarding more about Gujarati, Dalit, or whatever, I can, because only 2 short stories I have been able to locate in Gujarati. While in Marathi, you have in translation two major works in English translation. So thank you very much for giving me time to share my views.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Ketkar. I have myself like many questions, but we will just go to Professor Bose now, and then we will have follow-up discussions and questions after both lectures. So could you please stop sharing your share? So over to you, Professor Aparna Bose.
So a very warm good evening to one and all there. At the outset, of course, my heartfelt gratitude and thank you to Dr. Rekha Sethi and Dr. Fauzia Farooqi for having me here, for organizing this online lecture series on women's writings in India, issues and perspectives. Which is a collaborative venture between your respective universities, the Indraprastha College for Women and the South Asian Studies program at Princeton University. I congratulate my fellow speaker, Sachin, for giving this very detailed information on the history of the term Dalit and the Dalit movement in general. And I do agree with him that the subject is so vast in nature, in length and breadth, that it is really difficult to contain it within the limited time space that both of us share. But nevertheless, you know, I may perhaps add a little bit, expand a bit more to, you know, to his take on the whole movement in general. And then primarily concern myself with Dalit women poetry and Dalit women autobiographies. So without, you know, wasting much time, in a nutshell, a quick recap then. Dalit literature is a very, very powerful testament of post-colonial times and of the failures of democratic practices. Its predatory nature and gruesome, it's a gruesome reminder of Dalit delegitimization and insignification in due process. It has achieved remarkable distinction and distinctiveness on the basis of its social content. And this content has sort of differed with individual writers and their experiences. Dalit literature is a creative outburst emanating from socio-political liberation movements, which was a struggle basically from the tyranny of caste discrimination. Dalit consciousness is pertinent for Dalit literary productions because it represents Dalit subjectivity. It is this critical consciousness and self-awareness which is the unification point that prepares the individual writer to protest and overcome oppression. Dalit poetry, perhaps, is the most authenticated projection of this Dalit consciousness. And as poets and activists, the writers set out to communicate group oppression. Dalit as a category becomes the focal point to initiate dialogic interventions and debates, uniting under this denominator multiple diffusive diversities and heterogeneities amongst the oppressed masses. It signifies both the oppressed and the system of oppression. It becomes a political identity as opposed to the innumerable derogatory referrals underscoring the Dalit resolve to emancipate themselves from it all. As rightly pointed out by Sachin, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar becomes an important symbol in the Dalit counter discourse. He emblematizes the man who has handed over the most sacred, the most sacrosanct text of all, the Indian Constitution, that clearly outlaws centuries-old oppression, untouchability, and its related evils. He becomes the embodiment of a man who braved it all, who by sheer grit, determination, rose to be one of the most highly educated and remarkable leaders in the history of this country, the one to instill this renewed consciousness, self-respect. And as a man of the people, he politically organized the Dalits. As an intellectual, he authored voluminous texts and whose fight continued post-independence for demanding a separate electorate. As a man of true integrity, he decoded the codified Hindu scriptures through rationalization and interpreted the rational philosophy of Buddha as the ultimate paradigm, as the panacea, and as an alternative response against the prevalent rigidities and hegemonies. His vision of a classless and a casteless society is one that continues to give inertia to Dalit literary and cultural productions. And this Dalit critical consciousness also becomes a determinant and an apparatus to evaluate the suitability of literary texts that fall within its ambit, thus providing essential tools to judge its worth and merit to be part of Dalit literary and cultural productions. Sachin has already mentioned a little bit about the Little Magazine movement. I'll just add a little bit more. In Maharashtra, of course, this Little Magazine movement and of course the later progressive literary movement, which grew under the influence of Marxism, were contemporaneous to Dalit literary movement. They enhanced the critical perspective, the critical perception that sort of challenged the divinity of Marathi touchstones, making space to assess it objectively. Literature began to be related to the existing social realities and the prevalent conditions. The approach that examined literature based on this historical materialism had the potential to perhaps potentially justify the reasons for its creation. The progressive literary movement and its theoretical approach encouraged a very sociological approach to viewing literature and gave it a new aspect and respect, I must say. 1967 was the year that saw the Maharashtra Sahitya Bauddha Parishad holding its first conference, where it was observed that Dalit writers should revolt and produce their own literature through which their problems could be better highlighted. And through the funds which were raised by the students of Milind College, Aurangabad, a literary quarterly was launched, which later on metamorphosed into something like Asmita Darsha. To literally translate Asmita Darsha is a mirror of self-respect. That's what it meant, this literary journal. And it became a platform to encourage the new generation of Dalit writers. Many writers, of course, from the progressive movement too contributed in it. And secondly, the Dalit Literary Meet in Bombay again in 1967 gave an added impetus for the formation of this angry young man kind of image that came into Dalit writing. The harsh reality presented by Baburao Bagul set the benchmark for Dalit literary creation. The younger revolutionaries put forth their views on Dalit literature, underlined its role, and thus a new brand of aesthetical formulation came into existence. Um, on the other hand, the economic sector in Maharashtra was largely monopolized by the Maratha community. And in the name of cooperative movements, they really added misery to the lives of the Dalits in rural belts. Unemployment, frustrations, which rose steeply as a result of this whole capitalist system. You had, of course, education was spreading rapidly in rural areas. And there was also a group of educated Dalit youth who emerged and who felt that they have been very unjustly kept out of this socio-political system. They associated themselves with the workers of the leftist movement. And this, in a way, gave them a better understanding of the entire system, the harsh social realities, the inaction of the leaders of the Republican Party. This was the party, this was the political organ, this was the political mouthpiece, which was established by Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. So the inaction of the leaders of Republican Party post-Ambedkar, after his death, after his demise, and then the numerous splinters that Sachin was speaking about, the numerous factions, the general ennui and the fatigue that had set into the movement after Ambedkar also provided the necessary backdrop to Dalit writing. Poetry became a very powerful and very forceful genre to express this angst. Bagul, as I mentioned, blew the revolutionary bugle, and he influenced a whole generation of revolutionary poets like Namdev Dasal, J.V. Pawar, Raja Dhale, Arjun Kamble, Arjun Dangle, Arun Kamble, Vaman Nimbalkar. But what is also interesting, of this phase is that women writers wrote like never before, with force and power and fierce passion. On one side, you had the lack of leadership and inaction of different warring factions of the Republican Party founded by Ambedkar, and on the other side, the indifference shown by the left parties, barring few exceptions, of course, escalated the frustrations of these young writers who realized the utter futility of writing provocative poetry. And in order to widen their horizons, they established a dialogue with the Black literary movement in America. The Black Panthers pledged their full support. I have been a witness to numerous communications between Amiri Baraka and Namdev Dasal. I mean, so I have witnessed that. So anyway, Dalit Panthers was established on 9th July 1972 in Bombay, then Bombay, now Mumbai. These poets, they challenged the balkanization of Marathi as a language, its rigid standardization based on Brahminical values, and its normative cultural aesthetical practices, thereby freeing it from the arbitrary mainstream cultural restraints. They set their critical gaze on the canonical Marathi literary texts and what little they achieved in terms of mass appeal. Now, these writings set themselves against the dominant ideological cultural productions, the use of dialectical speech, unembellished raw Marathi. These were some of the distinctive traits of this poetry. With negativism, revolt, scientific objectivity, and sociological basis deeply entrenched, this poetry propounded new thoughts, new values, new heroes, new idols to look up to, something which was totally unknown to the Marathi literary world then. The revolutionary Dalit Panther movement had a gender, unfortunately, which was Dalit and male. Women voices were few but significant, and they tend to become more prominent with the Ambedkar movement, more poignant and pertinent with the Panther after the Panther period, that is post 1970s, and they enter very significantly into literary discourses. Now, this whole movement left in its wake a tremendous impact on life and letters. Dalit women voices dismantled both the androcentric nature of Dalit discourses as well as the mainstream feminist homogenization, process the way. The thrust of contemporary Marathi Dalit women poetry is to sort of renegotiate such power structures both within and without, to reflect on their identity and growth, and to perhaps present the intensity, the complexity of their experiences, both as Dalit and as women, which also challenges the casteist, sexist framework of the Indian society. It is a bold affirmation of the values of justice, liberty, equality, dignity, while also registering individual sorrow, pathos, suffering, frustration, anxiety, that in a way get translated as an expression of the community and of the marginalized in general. There has been a continuing upsurge of highly intellectual, well-educated Dalit women poets in Maharashtra who have been articulating their experiences with power in their own inimicable individual poetic styles, leading voices of the strong first wave. I call it the first wave. The first wave of Dalit women poetry in Maharashtra are names like Hira Bansode, Dr. Jyoti Langevar, my mother, incidentally, she happens to be my mother, Meena Gajbie, Surekha Bhagat, Meena Londe, Vimal Gadekar. Their poetry entails this gender sensitive issues, and they sort of contain the very seeds of empowerment that propounded radical transformation and survival. These writers, therefore, I feel, need to be relocated in the broader matrix of transformation. Hira Bansore is a poet who makes no compromises. Her poetry explores multiple possibilities and gives a new mantra to the powerless. And I quote, all these translations have been done by me. So I just quote from one of her poems. In that dark region, I take the sunrise. The pitiful sunset bends its head at every nook. Refugee-like, wipe away the deserts of your eyes. I have brought the pregnant flower buds of new inspiration to be sown in them. I have brought the sunrise for you. Get enlightened, get enlightened. Interestingly, her poem, Yashodhara, also speaks about women's suffering in isolation. In a very, very artistic manner, she paints the imagined agony of Buddha's wife, Yashodhara, who sacrificed her marital bliss for a husband who had abandoned his princely life to live as an ascetic in search of truth. Unlike a Sita or a Savitri, who are rather immortalized as paragons of virtue and personifications of ultimate goodness in the Indian context, Yashu, as the poet Hira Bansore very fondly calls Yashodhara, she says that probably Yashu does not find a place even in the Buddha Viharas for that matter. However, there is a very interesting poetic consolation at the end. And I quote, were you of no consequence? Wait, don't suffer thus. I have seen your beautiful face. You are between the closed eyelids of Siddhartha, unquote. Dr. Jyoti Langevar's poetry searches for specific words, language. I can actually go on, but with the paucity of time, I have to sort of curtail myself. I can give n number of quotations. Anyway, so speaking about Jyoti Langevar, her poetry searches for specific words, languages, language, images, symbols, and to speak on diverse themes. Her most celebrated poem, I Never Saw You, is blatantly wrought with political overtones, besides exuding a very strong social message. She presents a realistic picture of a deprived working class mother fighting amidst the grim circumstances of life, and who still has the potential to birth revolutions. The mother in her poem becomes the prototype for countless mothers whose names have been effaced from official historical records. And I quote from her poem, I never saw you. I never saw you in a newly brought, brilliant, brocaded, 9-yard Irikali sari. Now, Irikali is a kind of, it's a kind of heavy brocaded sari, and there is no verbal equivalent to that, so I have left it as it is. I never saw you in a newly brought, brilliant, brocaded, 9-yard Irikali sari, metal necklace adorned, or gold bracelets worn, not even rubber sandals on your feet. I saw you burning your souls in the scorched heat, hanging your abdomen's tender shoot, bundled on the acacia tree, carrying vats of tar amidst the construction crew, repairing roads, rags tied to your feet, planting a sweaty kiss to the naked child, trottingly running to you, pacifying the yearnings of your starved, entrails, writhing in agony, aiding to build a dam on the lake, slaving laboriously, I saw you. The women, in her poetry are poor, illiterate, belonging to the lowest strata of the society, of a class caste-ridden society, bearing infelicity of ages, as I said, and remaining nameless in this wilderness of patriarchy. And so she very befittingly glorifies. And she says, Mother, to me, your tattered sari's end is as dear as the national flag. The mountains of your dreams prodigious than the tall Himalayas. Your self-respect bears the soaring wings of an eagle. The blotches of your forehands sound an alarm for freedom. Your toil-worn body exudes infelicity of ages. The lexicon of your woes earmarks the greatest epic poem. The blues sung by your parched voice stands taller than the national anthem. And it goes on, so we'll move on to, all right. So what is interesting is here is this empowering poetry, which sort of universalizes women oppression, making brilliant use of myths sometimes, reworking, modernizing, appropriating them in the present context. Poems like Red Slogans on the Green Grass, where the use of Draupadi shaming episode of Mahabharata becomes a premise to speak of numerous incidents of rape and violations committed on women, and therefore quite aware of complex battles. Poets like her continue in their journey. They say, in these outcast hutments, the dreaded darkness burns me. The grievance on their arid lips are walled in my heart. Tell me, O abettors, fastening these barriers, how can I write a poem on your pruned green gardens, on leaves and flowers? The next poet I had in mind was Surekha Bhagat. Surekha Bhagat is yet another powerful voice that provokes a reader, incites and excites the readers. She exhibits that unfeminine militancy and casts an angry glance on what is not and what ought to be. Her desperation for change in the lives of the powerless is seen thus when she says Kabira, true value of religion lay in loving sympathy. I too feel the same. Humans should live like brave hearts in unity. If one eye is tormented, the other should pour. But why doesn't this happen? Eyes, for the sake of eyes, should remain vigilant. There are poets like Meena Gajbeh who wage a battle cry. Her poetry becomes an open manifesto of her priorities, and it kind of reminds you of the Black poet County Cullen and his poem, If We Must Die. She says, those weeping wounds of centuries, those stitches are ripped out by Marathwada. From now on, I live to die. Let the village become a burning ground. I will not live like a dog anymore. So interestingly, what you find is events of significance like the riots that ensued after the renaming of Marathwada University after B.R. Ambedkar, the countless lives that were lost in the process, they form the background to this poem. Women poets at times tormented by sexism and male chauvinism do not really clamor vociferously. Their poetry is constantly in search of their being, and despite the horrors of oppression, powerlessness, there is this tremendous sincerity and bountiful optimism that you come across in them. Contemporary Dalit women poetry reflects the impact of women liberation movements very clearly. However, I also feel that it doesn't like to be boxed into categories, defying traditional elements, transcending the frivolity of choked emotions. This poetry stirs the volcano inside. It does not stagnate due to self-indulgence. The second wave of Dalit poetry from Maharashtra has significant women voices like Pradnya Lokhande, Pradnya Dayapawar, as Sachin mentioned her, Sandhya Rangari, Vimal Gadekar, Asha Thorat, Usha Bhalerao, Usha Ambore, Pratibha Rajnan, Usha Hingonikar, Chandraprabha Nikam, Maya Vasnik Gedam, Pratibha Here. There are tribal poets like Kusum Alam, you have Usha Kiranatram, and others who are coming with equal force. Some of these poets are mostly city-based and also looking at several existential issues, besides taking up, speaking on diverse aspects of womanhood. Dalit women poetry of Maharashtra does not indulge in pseudo-sentimentalism, fantasy, or excess romanticism. It is serious, philosophical, it is mission-oriented, and it transports the readers towards new thoughts and values that can be purely described under New Dalit aesthetics. Its ultimate purpose is to branch out, to reach out to wider audiences, to incite and to sort of awaken them from the lethargy, to garner sensibility as well as sensitivity from those who perhaps may not share a common reality, but share a common purpose. And therefore, what I personally feel is this poetry does not indulge in self-pity nor apologies, but speaks on behalf of the entire community. There is no sloganeering, there is no hoarse shouting, there are no verbal expletives, no frantic outbursts. It does not allow aesthetical judgments to be dictated by political agendas, nor do these poets reduce artistic expression to chauvinistic Dalit propaganda. They do not write for social fashion, that is very clear. It is the unity of power and creativity that makes contemporary Dalit women poetry very bold and conversational in tone, shown off embellishments and jargon, and so on. I feel that today, when democratic values, secularism, socialism, when all these terms are being taken for a toss, one is constantly reminded of the revolutionary roles that writers, that poets particularly can play. And this poetry is a constant reminder of how personal and political collate, that a poet need not put blinkers and avoid political roles, and the newness of poetry can be constantly felt. The second part of my talk would, of course, focus on Dalit women autobiographies. Because of the paucity of time, I will hold on Dalit women poetry and move to Dalit women autobiographies. Dalit women autobiographies of Maharashtra, particularly, tend to interrogate the hegemonic assumptions and parameters of society, sort of addressing the intersectionality of caste, class, gender, ethnicity, and multiple other marginalizations. They attempt to destabilize the social system based on inequality and injustice, and really do not valorize the rise of an individual from rags to riches or to higher positions of power. But Dalit women autobiographies present a very complex interpersonal relationship, camaraderie, solidarity regarding wider spectrum of issues. As rightly pointed out by Sachin, they grew out of this Dalit socio-political consciousness and awareness of Dalit struggle from inhumanity and inequality, and are a product of the inspiration of Dr. Ambedkar's emancipatory vision, who mobilized the women to sort of join the various phases of his movement, be it the Mahad Satyagraha of 1927, the Nasik Satyagraha of 1930, or the conversion movement, the conversion to Buddhism movement in 1956. The Dalit women who had been part of Ambedkar's movements later, under the banner of Dalit women's movement, organized women across India and also wrote about it. Interestingly, there has been a considerable debate on upper caste women autobiographies. This is marked by correspondingly lack of critical apparatus, or rather interest in Dalit women writings, though I feel they have been writing substantially over a long period of time. They have been systematically marginalized in the academia. And the major reason for this is, I feel, their voices challenge the hegemonic superstructures and initiate a debate on marginality like their male counterparts, but they take it a little further from even their male counterparts. Today, Dalit autobiographies, narratives are published in almost all, every Indian language, it also in a way renders a multiplicity to Dalit women's life and experiences. But the Dalit women writings, the Dalit women narratives coming from Maharashtra, I feel, are far more pronounced and articulate in regard to the socio-political upheavals that kind of impact their writings, as also they are very explicit about caste, gender, sexism, both within and without. The historical contexts that are provided by these narratives center them in the debates and problems of their period. And these narratives give voice to the gendered constraints, compulsions, and limitations imposed by class, caste, sex. Secondly, what I feel and my study tells me is though there is enough scope in Dalit male autobiographical tradition to contextualize the socio-cultural struggle of people around them, they consciously seem to be avoiding this and instead talk a lot about themselves, Though they clamor for equality and freedom, somewhere it makes you feel whether they have internalized the caste Hindu male attitudes, namely male dominance, female subordination, blah, 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 it goes on. Well, Marathi Dalit women narratives came into public circulation, I must say, some 2.5 to 3 decades back, 2.5 decades back. And most of them, they belong to the larger universe of the Dalit movement, and their politics, as Sachin has pointed, differs by region, communities, and ideological positions. These narratives, they present the women's interpretation of society. I would start with Shantabai Dani's Ratra Din Amha. To translate it, it means for us, these nights and days. This was published in 1990. And a quick briefing on them, because I may not have the time at my disposal to go into the details of it, but a quick briefing on these narratives. Shantabai Dani's Ratra Din Amha encapsulates the journey, her journey, as a social and political activist, bringing to the forefront the hypocrisies of the right-wing fundamentalists, the deliberate attempt made by them to sort of spark riots during the Namantar period, that is the renaming of Marathwada University in the name of Dr. Ambedkar. She highlights the participation of Dalit women in the Dalit emancipatory movement, despite constraints of caste and gender, and underscores her personal commitment to the development of educational institutions. Her journey as an activist to being the governor's nominee to Maharashtra State Legislative Council weaves around a firm conviction that women and men need to support each other and they're part of this broad and larger humanity. Shantabai Kamble is yet another name, a very interesting name. She happens to be the mother of Dalit Panther, one of the notable Dalit Panthers, Arun Kamble. So Shantabai Kamble's autobiography, Majha Jalmachi Chittar Katha, which can be translated as the kaleidoscopic story of my life. This came into public circulation in 1988. It recalls the life of a woman activist and endorsing that there is no progress without education. Of course, this is what Babasaheb Ambedkar had said, that there's no progress for women without education. And you find her endorsing the same ideology in her narrative. Her narrative focuses on growing up poor, Dalit, and a woman, and she gives the reader a historical ride to the events that perhaps changed the whole course of Indian history, like the mass conversion to Buddhism, the active participation of Dalit women in the Scheduled Caste Federation, SCF, the popular sentiments of the people in those days, the frustrations felt by the leaders themselves, the changes that conversion wrought into the lives of the Dalit people, and of course, with the death of Ambedkar, and her dismal presence. So, you have all of it in there. The resistance of Shantabai to everyday practices of untouchability, her fascination, her yearning to sort of listen, to read voraciously, her anger, her angst against the traitors of the movement, one finds her retaining that tenor quite uncompromisingly. The radical change that she brings by becoming the first woman teacher in Sholapur district of Maharashtra, and later becoming an education officer. So it's a whole process of that journey, which sort of finds itself in her pages. Babitai Kamble is another important name, and I think Sachin has mentioned that in passing. Babitai Kamble's Jeena Amsa, which translates as Our Lives, it got published in 1986, and it also got published as The Prisons We Broke. It was translated by Maya Pandit. Babitai Kamble's narrative functions on multiple levels, as a personal narrative, as a caste narrative, as a gender narrative. And there is this remarkable consciousness that seems to transcend from personal accounting to that of community. It's a true critique of caste Hinduism. Its pernicious practices, patronized superstitions of violence and brutality against the Dalit women folk. Instead of romanticization, there is an overt articulation with subtle deployment of irony, mingled humor that you find there interspersed all over. And that becomes also, I feel, an empowering means, an act of resistance against dominance. Yet another interesting name. Do I have time? Uh, can't hear you.
We have 7 minutes, like
Right,
within the session.
I'll find out.
So, and we want to have some, there is at least like one question there, and I have a couple of questions.
Right.
So, yeah.
Right, I'll just quickly skip through then. There's Kumud Paude's Antasport, which means thoughtful outburst, 1981, which presents the difficulty of choosing an untrodden path for a Dalit woman, despite having merit, how she merits exclusion due to the biases existing against them. Her book is a testimony of a difficult journey from being, the first to being a first Sanskrit professor, at the university. Dalit women narratives, I think, like the male narratives, they single out oppressive caste Hindu ideology for Dalit subordination. They do not consider, they not just consider, I feel, subordination of Dalit women as a resultant phenomena, but they also hold it as an unpardonable, dehumanizing force responsible for Dalit patriarchy. Urmila Pawar's mention was made. Urmila Pawar's Aidan, I'll take this and then I'll sort of wind up. So Urmila Pawar's Aidan, translated as a weave of bamboo, takes us to the Konkan region of Maharashtra, where weaving bamboo baskets was a caste-based occupation. Pawar sort of finds a very close connect, she finds a very close connection, one of unspoken pain between the weave of the Aidan her mother made and sold for a living and her writing. You have memories of untouchability, discrimination, caste, labor, of community. She graphically presents to you the male notion of virginity and highlights sexism both within and without the Dalit community, how women committed themselves but still struggle to find a place amidst men and women. Her pertinent question is, women are everywhere, and yet where is the Dalit woman? How far her narrative can be juxtaposed with the narratives of other Dalit women, and how far her gender documentation is representational could be debatable. But these narratives, all these narratives, they do not follow the mainstream Marathi male-female autobiographical tradition. Neither do they follow the defining characteristics of the Dalit male autobiographical tradition. Some of these narratives, when they were written, were perhaps not even accepted by the male Brahminical elites and critics as part of an authentic literary tradition. The rhetoric that is used to resist, manipulate, negotiate, and expose these social, political, gender oppressions, the writing style, the lingua of resistance demonstrates a unique Dalit female voice, a mother tongue, so to say. At times, rebellious rhetoric extenuates and elevates a very distinctive female character, thereby rendering a move from the margins. Sachin has been speaking about that, so I might just round it up in a nutshell. The emergence of Dalit feminism has challenged multiple oppressions, both within and without, and sort of reflects the decisiveness of women to carry the banner, challenging hegemonic conformisms. They, as I said, dismantle the androcentric nature of linguistic discourses that have been persistently problematic for their cause. So Dalit feminist standpoint does provide an alternative to the notion of Dalit womanhood, ensuring the cessation of monolithic constructs, which are rather exclusionary and often too misleading. The Dalit feminist consciousness is no more nascent as it was assumed some 2.5, 3 decades back. And writings which are pouring from different corners of the country only supplicate to this as a glaring evidence of its effervescence and vibrancy. And Dalit women writings stand challenging elitist writings in content, form, purpose, motivation, language, ideology, experiential reality, aesthetics. It's shaped by powerlessness, and it is through writing that it asserts and arrives at articulating the self, which is dynamic. They are, I feel, they are not just caste-centered, caste-based discourses dealing with exclusionary politics, but they hold a lot more. Even if there is this predominant note of despair, aesthetically, they achieve a lot more because the narrator as the subject is decentralized, and the personal narrative moves into this impending debate on caste, and then it moves to the nation. Retrospectively, what gets projected is the Dalit world's outcry and Dalit's critique of nationalistic ideologies. Also, though the graphic projections of the seamer side of the underbelly, by drawing attention to all these, it sort of draws attention to the subhuman level of existence, setting a tone for reverse aesthetics that works through ugliness, repulsion, distancing, rather than the traditional understanding of aesthetics that we have. I think I have exceeded my time, and I will halt here with thank you once again to all the panelists and for this patient hearing. Thank you for having me here.
Thank you, Professor Bose. Thank you, Professor Ketkar. Both of you gave very informative, I would say, and thought-provoking lectures. And I myself was taking notes, and I learned a lot. And I teach, my languages are Hindi and Urdu, but I teach South Asian literatures in translation. And I always have Dalit literature as a unit, but I never focused particularly on Dalit feminist writings or Dalit women's writings. And so as in the very beginning, I said that Dalit literature is a canon that goes beyond languages, and I have very limited knowledge. But even with my limited knowledge, I can see how different Hindi Dalit literature is from Marathi Dalit literature. And as I said, that I have been reading mostly Dalit literature written by men, and even so I'm familiar with Kannada, Telugu, Marathi, and Hindi, those four linguistic canons. So I have like so many questions, but before, I guess I should ask my own question. I guess like as a moderator, I should let other people ask their questions first. So Rekha ji, if you have a question, and there is one, a very
actually, we should read out the questions on the chat box first.
And
these are
yeah,
very
so
important questions.
yeah, so I will just read the question, and then I will let panelists, the speakers, decide who wants to respond to which one. So, of course, there is just a powerful presentation on Dalit feminist poet by Shobha Rajgopal, but in terms of questions, there's one question: why is there so much similarity between Black feminism and Dalit feminism? Is it shared experience, or is it intentional? And then another question is, how does Dalit literature deal with religion regarding the Hindu caste? It might be somehow pessimistic or critical, particularly in feminist writings of India. So I will let the speakers actually first comprehend the question, because there are so many layers and so many things said in this question. So this is from Ataullah Fazil.
All right, so I'll go with the first. Does Sachin, do you want to take that? Should I go with the Black feminism, Dalit feminism?
No, I think you can go ahead, Aparna. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so Maharashtra in India, in fact, has been a base for several revolutionary reformist movements, and this, since it has also been the epicenter of Dr. Ambedkar's struggle for emancipation. Dalit literature forms the backbone of this, backbone of Indian literature today, and has enlivened it from the kind of stereotypes that it had sort of relegated, in the last few decades. Dalit movement owes a lot to the Black emancipation struggle, no doubt, in America. And just like the Black activists identified themselves with the Dalits, you have poets like Nikki Giovanni, comparing themselves to the untouchables of India. there are similar parallels that you come across in Dalit women poetry too,
Yeah,
you know.
I had just to add to that, because that when I teach Dalit literature, if I have African American students in my class, they immediately respond in a very personal way. I had an African American student taking my popular trends in South Asian literature course, and did his final paper comparing Dalit literature and Black literature. Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, I have published numerous papers with this kind of comparative. So that's the reason why I observed such.
Yeah, but I guess the question is it intentional as a politics, or?
Can I respond?
So okay, yeah, Sachin.
Yeah. First is that race and caste, I think
These are
they
two.
operate as exclusionary, as a marginalizing construct in similar ways as well as in some dissimilar ways. Means given the kind of religious uh, paraphernalia associated with caste, you may not find that much kind of, wherein actually Christianity can also be seen as liberating at times. For example, when I think of Martin Luther King and others, I think so. There are similarities and dissimilarities, but both are hierarchic and exclusionary and oppressive categories. So there would be definitely parallels. And secondly, as Aparna rightly pointed out, Black Afro-American literature has been a source of inspiration for example, Black Panther movement inspired Dalit Panther movement, for example. So there are inspirations as well. So the similarities definitely crop up due to these two things.
Also, if you look at the struggle, the struggle both ends. It is this feminist consciousness of for legitimizing their rights as women. And in a way, it also helps us to sort of understand the very universal nature of oppression, you see, the very universal nature of struggle on the part of oppressed, underprivileged, anywhere in the world for that matter. Why just Black writers for that sake? You know, Dalit literature, Dalit women writing can be universal. Like, I mean, I'm not using the word universal in the literary context, but you know, race, caste, gender, these are integrated concerns. And they are awaiting social transformation, and writers both in African American writers of color and Dalit women writers, they are exploring their full range of voice. So there are bound to be parallels. As I said, I have been a witness to the correspondences of Namdo Dasal and Amiri Baraka. So, Panther was a very glorious period in American literary history too. You had a whole stream of writers like, right from Nikki Giovanni, Sonia Sanchez, Maya Angelou, and a whole host of them, who were articulating as vociferously as their male counterparts. So parallels are bound to sort of, exist. And in fact, they should. I don't know if I've answered the question.
No, you did. Thank you. So the second question about how does Dalit literature deal with religion regarding the Hindu caste? Because Professor Ketkar, you mentioned about Christianity. It can be liberating, but I'm not an expert, but as far as I know, Christianity as a concept, as a framework, as an idea is not used to subjugate Black community, but in India, for example, it is Hindu religion is used for the subjugation of the Dalit community. So how do they reconcile? I think it's a very important question.
As I said, one of the distinctive features of Ambedkarite movement in Maharashtra is the rejection of Hinduism in favor of Buddhism. So yes, it's a negation of Hindu traditions in a very important way. So that is, and turn towards Buddhism to find, as Aparna said, rational basis for religion. He's also Ambedkar considered many options before turning to Buddhism. So, and he knew that religion is an important binding force. Like even Pule, for example, talks about Nirmik and in Satyashodak Sabha, and as a kind of secular and inclusive notion of divinity instead of Brahminical divinity. So religion remains an important aspect in both Phule and Ambedkarite struggle. So there is a negation of Brahminical Hinduism, but at the same time, you turn towards either Buddhism or towards Nirmik, as Phule in his Satyashodak Dharma would talk about. So
But
there is a critique of established religion, definitely.
uh,
Sharp.
both of you mentioned, how this neo-Buddhism or using Buddhism as as a force to bring everyone on the same platform, and also kind of challenge classical Brahmanic Hinduism. However, in because we discussed Bai Chizat in my class just this last week, and then we see that how that part in the story where um, Tara goes to her family members and starts talking about her husband, like how he brought another wife, and then people start talking about how this gaon, this village has vihar, God Buddha Vihar, the other didn't get, and so in a way they are. In a way, the writer seems to be criticizing this, and that the whole Buddhism, the Buddha Vihar thing, is not really helping women. It's a distraction, and that this is identity politics for the sake of identity politics. So, are Dalit feminists are they rejecting Buddhism as well, or and also?
They would be criticizing, as Aparna rightly pointed out. Means she talks about Yashodhara as a figure in some of the poems, where how they point out to the patriarchal structures within Buddhism which has marginalized women. So there is a kind of revisionary rethinking about Buddhism as well from a feminist perspective.
Yeah, I'm personally very curious about the kind of depiction of Yashodhara and the focus on Yashodhara in Dalit feminist literature, because as I said, I'm not very familiar with Dalit feminist literature. I'm more familiar with general Dalit, male Dalit literature, because we have in Hindi a very celebrated poem, Yashodhara. I'm not sure if you are familiar with it, by Maithili Sharan Gupt, where Yashodhara comes as a kind of upper caste, like Kshatriya, Nari, woman, and warrior caste woman. So it would be interesting to see how these early 20th century sovereign Hindi writers focused on certain, with sympathy, with patronizing, and in a patronizing way, focused on certain Hindu female characters, and how Dalit women writers are focusing on them. So is there any study done on this?
I think Aparna would be able to, throw more light on that, because she has brought it up in her speech. So
I think it's not just the upper caste male-centric gaze towards women representation, but even Dalit men autobiographies, for that matter. They have a lot to say. I mentioned that they have a lot to say about themselves. The Dalit woman has been denied her humanness by Dalit male writers too. In that sense,
I would like to add a point here. In Hindi, actually, I have worked on Sushila Thakure.
Okay.
And there is an anthology of Dalit women's poetry edited by Rajni Tilak. So in the introduction to that anthology, Rajni Tilak says that if we are asked, we will stand by our male partners whenever there is a conflict of caste. So our first struggle is for the caste. But we are experiencing the same patriarchal behavior within our households, because the men in the Dalit community are also oppressed and marginalized just like the women are. So in that way, we stand in solidarity with them. But when it comes to the household, they behave just like the upper caste men would do with the women within their families. So she says our second struggle, or the double marginalization, or the question of Dohra Abhishap, I think it
Dora
starts.
Abhishek is by Kaushalya Baisantri, the Hindi writer.
Yeah.
And let me tell you one thing, that Dalit women writing doesn't hold the Dalit male as the enemy number one, as the primary enemy. Yes,
Yeah.
sexism is spoken about, but just like the male, the black, women writing, they believe in active cooperation of the men folk because they have been part of common history, you see. And admittedly, since I did, because of the paucity of time, as I said, there are a couple of things that I needed to mention about the Dalit male autobiographical tradition too. The presentation of women in these autobiographies, I mean, this is my personal take, you may disagree with that. It doesn't seem to be justified to me. I mean, there's this lack of self-introspection, keeping a very particular point of view, speaking about oneself, how we suffered, instead of presenting how we suffered till date, how unjust this social system has made us suffer, how we evolved, grew, and became intellectuals, how this social system then applauded us. You find that most of this male autobiographical tradition tends to talk mostly about how the social system rejected them, how they suffered hunger, poverty, and progressed, etc., etc., etc. I think intellectually, they don't move beyond the traditional framework of husband, home, hearth, children. That's also with some of the Dalit female women autobiographies. I will give you an instance. Dalit male autobiographical tradition doesn't break the socio-cultural frame of their time. In the same way, you find few Dalit women autobiographies also lingering in that same frame. I'm going to be a little critical here. Though there is enough scope in the male autobiographical tradition to sort of contextualize socio-cultural struggle of people around them, they seem to be consciously avoiding this. I mean, I'll give you the example of Lakshman Mane's Upra, which is translated as outsider. Now, Sashi, the woman character in Lakshman Mane's Upra, is an upper caste woman who loves and elopes with the narrator Lakshman, belonging to the backward Kaikadi community, Now, here the writer could have easily shown the emotional, psychological, domestic and social agitation of Sashi. But the narrator is so engrossed in, the pathos of self that he doesn't seem to be conscious of any other thing except himself. And therefore, he doesn't seem to do justice to Sashi. And Sashi remains an upra, an outsider in the writer's life sketch, you see. So there are multiple examples.
There's also an autobiography by Namdev Dhasal's wife.
But then she doesn't get into the category of Dalit women writing.
No. But the kind of outsider view you are talking about, the wife, so Namdev Dhasal's wife in her autobiography brings out many issues, which are again...
I come back to my point, Dr. Rekha. I come back to my point. As Tagbore, you have mentioned her autobiography. The ultimate aim, the ultimate purpose is commitment towards the society, for which the writer is ready to pay the price. It's not that sexism is not being challenged and spoken by the women writers, but at the same time, they do not look on the Dalit man as their primary enemy, because this is very well understood that they've been part of the same historical struggle. And that's why in my I may have said this randomly, that Dalit women autobiographies move a further step ahead from the Dalit male autobiographical tradition. There can be multiple examples. And coming back to that point, why we need to sort of compare, why the need for Dalit feminism, Black feminism. I think it's very enterprising. It's very rewarding, when you make a comparative analysis, particularly. It's very, very rewarding. It sort of enhances this mutual understanding of different disparate cultures, people, their experiences of injustice. And at the same time, it sort of provides a framework, a forum for debate against ongoing perpetration of violations of injustices, and also endorses the need to sort of move beyond boundaries. And that's what literature has to do, really. It has to move beyond boundaries. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, we can go on and keep talking about it. This is, we just have, I would say, haven't even scratched the surface, and so much to learn. But I will just ask one last question, and of course, like, this question cannot be really answered because it's such a big question, but I'm just asking it for the sake of documentation so that we can go home thinking more about it. As I mentioned before the session started, that this is, we just brought all these, all of us, you know, this is a platform we all came together so that we can start a conversation and carry on the conversation even beyond this lecture series. So my question is that it seems like, you know, there is, of course, so it is Dalit feminist writing, you know, it's a category because they are writing as Dalit, as you, as Professor Aparna, you said that they think that Dalit man is not their primary enemy, and they, you know, they are fighting against the caste system. However, but then we are calling these writings Dalit feminist writing, not just Dalit writing. So there is like this contradiction and this tension that is going to be there. I mean, these days we have this Muslim feminist writing, but I am, again, a non so practicing Muslim, and I consider myself feminist. I just do not understand this category of Muslim feminist. And so my question is that if they are, so if we call this category is justified because they don't consider Dalit feminist writing, this category is justified because they don't consider Dalit man their primary enemy. So they are basically Dalit. But my question is, they are writing, is it primarily Dalit writing, and then within Dalit writing, they are expressing women's issues and women concerns? That's why we are calling it Dalit feminist writing, or the writing is primarily feminist, but as all women write from their own social cultural context, and their social cultural context is Dalit. So is the politics feminist and situation Dalit, or just the opposite? So that's my question. Or is the politics is feminist, situation Dalit, or the politics is actually, you know, showing solidarity with the Dalit men, but just on the side, documenting their own problems and issues?
I think
So again, I said, we cannot
interesting.
resolve the, but I want to hear your comments.
Yeah, but interesting, I think angle can be brought in from Gujarati Dalit feminists, because they don't, I have not seen the term being used in the Gujarati context at all. We have women writers, and very often they write as Dalit, and they write from a kind of, they talk about female subject. But they means I have come across only two short stories. There are two writers that I came across, and they have certain short story collections which I haven't been able to access because they themselves brought them out. That is something that to be thought of. But their stories, when I went through in Gujarati, I could sense that it's not so much like, say, for example, Urmila Pawar is doing, she's critiquing patriarchy directly from a feminist perspective, or Prajna Daya Pawar is critiquing patriarchy as well within and outside. They are writing more from women's perspective and critiquing caste. But at the same time, the protagonists reflect certain aspirations and issues that they have to confront as women. So maybe they are not aware of this theorization and politics of Dalit feminism, because I have not seen that word being discussed so much in Gujarati circles. But these writers are women and they articulate. So you can, I think, again, as Aparna is rightly talking about comparative perspectives. So in Marathi, you can see that it's strident Dalit feminism. You don't separate these two. It's critique of patriarchy and caste very often, as in Ambedkar, sides of the same coin, as he rightly points out. But in Gujarati, you have a kind of critique of caste, but from, and the subject is, and subjectivities and points of view are women, which is very...
about Muslim women writing, because that's also this kind of category, even though the situation is very, very different, of course, because a Muslim woman writer can come from a privileged background as well. However, I have seen that even those writers who were writing from a progressive, point of view, including Ismat. So sometimes I feel like the contemporary scholars are imposing certain categories on these writers, not so like Ismat is now a Muslim writer. So I guess my anxiety and my confusion, bafflement is also coming from
I feel
there.
feminism always had a very symbiotic relationship with autobiography. In fact, however, it has not always been passive. You see, it had its own questions to ask out of feminism too. Post-structuralists, of course, began to transform feminist thinking, and autobiography, became a major site for historical, theoretical debates. So women autobiographies here too, when you talk of Dalit writing, can be read as a strategic necessity, at a particular time rather than an end itself. And the problematization with this word Dalit feminist, when the Dalit woman does not consider the Dalit man as a primary enemy, she does not even absolve the upper caste man of his, burden in that sense. So I just wanted to add that. So hypothetically, at least there is this need to distinguish, to demarcate it as,
and I think Muslim feminist would be a very different category compared to Dalit feminists.
Yes,
It would be
yeah.
very
I
different
agree.
in the sense that you're looking at a very different location, cultural history, and because as you rightly pointed out, Ismat Chugtai or even
I'm
Putula
not
Haidar,
comfortable with
these are
that
such
category.
these are such a huge names in
Yes.
themselves that they
Yeah.
actually you can't create such a category for them, at least, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
But in
So
Dalit family, it's a very different category, right?
yeah.
Socio-cultural category.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Ketkar. Thank
Yeah,
you,
my
Professor
pleasure.
Bose.
Thanks for
It
having
was a
me.
very, as we, it was very thought-provoking
Thank you.
session. And thank you, Srinjoy, for hosting. Thank you, Rekhaji. Thanks to all the attendees who came to listen to our lecture. And next Friday, we are going to focus on northeastern region. We are going to focus on Assamese and other regional languages from the northeastern part of India. Looking forward to seeing you all there. And that will be our 10th lecture. Rekha ji and we are thinking about whether we should add one more session to kind of bring some of the burning questions that emerged from all these 10 lectures, not necessarily to respond to all those answers, but to ask all these questions together that can provide some starting points for certain new projects for all of us as scholars. So thank you, everyone. We'll see you next Friday. Srinjoy, you can take it from there.
Thank you so much,
when you're ready.
everyone. Yeah, thank you so much. I'm just going to end the meeting now.
Thank you.